Hey guys, tonight we wade into the slow, silty pulse of life along the Nile in the 18th century. Picture yourself standing barefoot on the riverbank, the late summer air heavy with humidity, and an expectant stillness stretching across the floodplain. The first glimmer of the annual inundation is here, a darker ripple far upstream, slowly swelling toward you like a lazy, unstoppable tide. The water is calm now, but it carries the weight of survival for everyone you know. Without it, the soil cracks, the grain fails, and you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch low, fingertips brushing the cool mud at the water's edge. The Nile has been whispering its approach for days. The fishermen upstream spoke of faster currents, of floating twigs from faraway forests. Now, here it is, the official start of the flood. In the 18th century, you don't have satellite forecasts or a cheerful weather app telling you when to plant. You have the river itself, and the river is rarely wrong. The first rise is subtle. The banks glisten, their edges dissolving into slow, creeping water. Birds shuffle to higher branches. Even the donkeys seem restless, swishing their tails more than usual. Historians still argue whether farmers of the time could predict the exact arrival of the inundation by smell alone. Some claim the wind carried a mineral tang from the highlands. Others insist it was the scent of decaying plant matter flushed from distant swamps. You're not sure which camp you belong to, but there's no denying the air feels different. Mainstream records note that these floods were the lifeline of Egyptian agriculture, timed by nature's own clock and powered by rains thousands of miles south. But here, in this moment, it's less about grand geography and more about your bare feet sinking half an inch deeper into fresh, cold silt. Someone calls from the village, pointing to a makeshift stick gauge shoved into the bank. The notch marking Goodyear is already halfway underwater. That's a good sign. No disastrous drought, but hopefully not the kind of flood that swallows fields and goats whole. You've heard stories of those years, when the water came roaring instead of strolling, tearing away storage jars, drowning entire patches of date palms. You'd prefer the gentle version, thank you very much. Downriver, a crocodile's eye glints just above the surface, far enough not to panic anyone, but close enough for the old men to mutter warnings. They've seen fools wade too deep, chasing drifting baskets only to vanish under a swirl of scales and teeth. You keep your distance. The river gives life, but it doesn't care who you are. Along the shallows, a few kids splash recklessly, oblivious to crocodile etiquette. Their mothers yell half-heartedly, hands still busy weaving reed mats. Laughter carries over the water, mixing with the slow slap of current against mud. Somewhere, a heron snaps its beak around an unlucky fish. You're reminded that everything here, from farmers to birds to reptiles, has been waiting for this very moment. A quirky local habit kicks in. As soon as the first floodwater touches a house's steps, some families place a small bowl of milk by the river. It's meant to please Hapi, the Nile god, though you're pretty sure the cats get to it first. Still, traditions matter. They anchor people through unpredictable years, much like your grandfather's habit of measuring water with his walking stick, even though there's a perfectly good communal gauge. By nightfall, the river will have claimed a little more ground. The air will be cooler, the frogs louder, the mosquitoes braver. You'll fall asleep to the sound of slow-moving water outside your door. A lullaby you didn't ask for, but can't imagine living without. And as you lie there, you'll know this is just the beginning. The flood is a promise. Tomorrow, the real work starts. You step out in the pale dawn, and the air feels heavy with promise and mosquitoes. The Nile has crept a little higher overnight, licking at the edges of the fields. It's not enough to start planting yet, but enough to change the texture under your bare feet. You walk out into the waterlogged patch, toes curling into the slick, sucking mud. That oddly satisfying pull that makes every step feel like the river is trying to keep you for itself. Testing the soil is not a matter of sticking a fancy thermometer or probe in the ground. It's all you, your senses, and your willingness to get dirty. You kneel down, dig your fingers into the soft brown-black earth, and squeeze. If it holds together in a clump without crumbling, you know it's ready to embrace seeds. If it oozes between your fingers in a slow, sticky ribbon, you wait. Patience is the Nile farmer's secret weapon, though sometimes it's just enforced by the fact that rushing means disaster. You watch your neighbor, old Fami, who's been doing this since before you could walk. He squats low, rolls a ball of mud between his palms like it's dough, and flicks it expertly onto the bank. It splats in a way only he seems to understand. He nods to himself. That nod is worth more than any official decree. Mainstream history will tell you that the annual flooding deposited nutrient-rich silt that made Egypt the breadbasket of empires. True, but it leaves out the small truths. The smell of wet earth is stronger than your morning coffee. The way frogs scatter when you drag your feet. The way mud somehow ends up on your face, even if you swore you didn't touch it. In the quieter parts of the bank, you notice something else. Small, spiraled snail shells clinging to reeds. Some farmers see them as good luck, others as pests that nibble tender shoots. Historians still argue whether ancient farmers actively encouraged certain water snails to aerate the soil or simply tolerated them because removing them was too much trouble. You lean toward the too much trouble theory. And then there's the worms. You can't escape them. They wriggle in the freshly softened mud like they've been waiting all year for this buffet. Fami swears they're the river's fingers mixing the soil. You're not sure about that, but you have to admit they do their job well. Overhead, the sky shifts from gold to that deep Nile blue you never quite see anywhere else. The sun will be brutal in an hour, so you work quickly. You shuffle across the field, bending, prodding, feeling for that perfect moisture level. Your calves are already speckled with drying flecks of mud, which will soon crack and fall away like brittle paint. A young boy, probably no more than 10, trudges past with a reed basket full of seedlings. His father walks behind him, ankle-deep in the shallows, muttering instructions. You can hear every splash, every squelch. This is the sound of the planting season awakening. No trumpets, no ceremonies, just human feet and river mud repeating a rhythm older than kingdoms. A quirky superstition floats through your mind, one your aunt swears by. If your first step into the season's flood mud makes a schluck sound instead of a squish, it means a good harvest. You try not to notice that yours was definitely more of a squish. By midday, you've tested enough patches to know tomorrow will be planting. Tonight, you'll sleep with the smell of wet soil still clinging to you. It's not perfume, but here, it's the scent of survival. By the time the next morning's light filters through the palm fronds, you're already in motion. The date palms stand tall above the damp fields, their shadows long and thin, stretching toward the shimmering Nile. Today isn't about mud or planting, at least not directly. Today is about information. And where do you get the most valuable intel in the 18th century Nile Valley? Not from any official scribe, but from the shade under the date palms. You arrive at the grove just as a few neighbors settle onto woven mats. The palms sway lazily overhead, their fronds whispering in the breeze, scattering little specks of golden dust that catch the sunlight. Someone has set down a clay jug of cool water. You can already see the condensation making it glisten. Conversations start with polite nods, but quickly slip into weather rumors and the agricultural equivalent of tall tales. Mainstream historical accounts might say that farmers timed planting by the river's predictable patterns, but here you know better. Human nature is to speculate endlessly. One man insists the flood will last 3 weeks longer than usual. I heard it from my cousin's brother-in-law who saw a cloud shaped like a crocodile. Another swears the flood will end early because the ibis are roosting lower in the trees. Historians still argue whether bird behavior was actually used as a forecasting tool, or if it was just something people said to sound wise while sipping date wine. You lean back against the rough trunk of a palm, the bark pressing little ridges into your shoulders. A gust of wind rustles the fronds and dislodges a dried date, which drops neatly into your lap. Perfect timing. You pop it into your mouth, sweet, sticky, with that faint, grainy texture that tells you it's from last season's batch. It's a small pleasure, one that's worth the risk of getting bonked on the head by falling fruit. Further down the row of palms, two older women are in an animated debate about whether to use clay or reed baskets for seed storage. Clay keeps rodents out, one says. Reed is lighter and less likely to break when dropped, says the other. You know the truth. Both will eventually fail if you don't guard them. That's where the village cats come in. And they tend to take naps exactly when the rats are boldest. Someone tells a story, and as always you're not sure if it's history or pure fiction, about a farmer who tied tiny bells to his goats during flood season so he could hear if they wandered too close to the river. Worked like a charm, the storyteller claims, though you can't help picturing a crocodile listening to the jingling like it's a dinner bell. From your seat in the shade, you can see the edge of the flood creeping higher in the distance, the sunlight dancing off the ripples. You take a slow sip from the jug, cool water coating your throat, and let the chatter wash over you. Every so often, someone glances upward to check the dates. The palms are more than just a gossip hub. They're also a calendar. When the first fruits drop heavily, it's usually time to start certain irrigation tasks. When the fronds start yellowing, it means the river's peak is nearing its end. No almanac needed. And as the morning drifts into midday, you realize you've learned nothing certain, but somehow feel better informed. That's the magic of the date palm gossip circle. You walk away no surer of the truth, but far more entertained. By now, the sun is high enough to turn the river's surface into a band of blinding silver. You squint as you step into the fields, knowing today will be all about grain, emmer wheat to be exact, and grit, lots of grit. Harvesting emmer isn't the gentle, romantic image you might imagine from painted tomb walls. It's back-breaking, wrist-aching work under a sun that seems personally offended by your existence. The stalks are ready, tall and golden, bending slightly under the weight of their grain heads. You grab a handful and slice low with your curved sickle. The dry stalks whisper against each other, releasing tiny clouds of chaff into the air. Chaff that immediately finds its way into your nose. You sneeze. Somewhere, a lark laughs at you. Mainstream history likes to note that emmer wheat was a staple food of Egypt, the base for bread and beer alike. But no one mentions the sand. It's everywhere, drifting from the desert, kicked up by donkey hooves, blown into the fields by wind that refuses to mind its own business. Even freshly threshed grain carries the faint crunch of it, a reminder that you're basically eating the landscape whether you want to or not. You pause to wipe your forehead, your palm leaving a streak of sweat-darkened dust. Old Hannah, who's been harvesting since before you were born, leans on her sickle and tells you to watch for the wrong rustle, a sound in the stalks that means a snake has wandered in. Historians still argue whether snakes are genuinely drawn to harvest fields for prey, or if it's just one of those warnings elders use to keep young people alert. Either way, you decide it's not worth testing. The work moves in a rhythm. Bend, grab, slice, toss into the pile. Bend, grab, slice, toss. Your back begins to protest, but you keep going. Occasionally you catch the scent of something faintly sweet, crushed grain mixing with the warm smell of sun-baked stalks. That's the only part of this job that feels poetic. A young boy runs past, chasing a chicken that has decided to help itself to the piles. The bird dodges like an experienced thief, disappearing between stalks, feathers glinting in the light. You almost envy its energy. Nearby, a pair of donkeys stand tethered, swishing their tails impatiently. They're waiting to carry the bundles to the threshing area. One of them eyes you with that judgmental donkey look, the kind that says, "You think you have it hard? Try chewing dry grass all day." The heat climbs higher, and the fields start to shimmer. Every time you lift your head, you see the mirage-like wavering of the air, as if the land itself is sighing. Sweat drips into your eyes, and you blink it away. By late afternoon, your arms are leaden, your neck stiff, but you've made progress. A long, neat row of cut grain, stacked and ready for transport. As you stand, stretching your back until it pops, You realize the worst is over. Until threshing day, of course. Then you'll get to breathe in even more dust. Still, there's satisfaction in the sight, golden mounds waiting to become bread, beer, and the base of nearly every meal you'll eat this year. You might grumble about the grit between your teeth, but you wouldn't trade this crop for anything. You wander toward the riverbank in the cooling late afternoon, the golden fields behind you and the glittering water ahead. The heat still clings to your skin, but the shadows are lengthening, and the hum of insects is louder than the chatter of the village. That's when you see it, a ripple in the shallows that doesn't belong to the wind. A crocodile. It's not large by the standards you've heard whispered, not one of the monster river lords said to be long enough to block a boat, but still large enough that you feel the instinctive tightening in your chest. Its eyes, two gleaming coins set above the waterline, follow your movement without a single ripple from the rest of its body. You stop. It stops. Mainstream history tells you crocodiles were feared and sometimes even revered in parts of Egypt, linked to the god Sobek. Offerings were made, temples were built, and mummified crocs have been found in burial sites. But here, standing ankle-deep in muddy shallows, it's not mythology you're thinking about. It's the distance between you and those teeth. Old Fahmy once told you that crocs near the edge are usually more curious than hungry. Historians still argue whether that's true or just something people say to calm each other. You decide not to test the theory. Further down the bank, a fisherman pretends not to notice the reptile. His reed boat bobs gently as he hauls in a net glittering with fish. The croc doesn't move. Maybe it's full, maybe it's patient. You've heard they can wait for hours, barely moving, just a pair of eyes in the water. You wonder what it sees in you, a threat, a snack, or just another odd, two-legged river creature. You step back slowly, your feet finding the squish of soft mud. The bank smells of damp reeds and something sharper, the unmistakable musk of crocodile. It's a scent that clings in memory more than in the air. Near the village edge, a group of children shout and splash, their joy echoing over the water. You want to yell at them to get out, but you know they've been told 100 times. Still, it's unsettling to watch a predator drift silently downstream toward their game. A dog barks, loud, sharp, insistent, and suddenly the croc dips beneath the surface. Gone. Just like that. Some people here believe crocodiles can hear human voices from far off and that singing to them can keep them away. A quirky old woman in the village sings a nonsense song whenever she washes clothes by the river. A lilting, repetitive tune with no words you understand. She swears it works. Maybe the crocs just don't like her voice. As the sun dips behind the palms, you glance once more at the slow-moving water. Somewhere beneath, that reptile is gliding silently, unseen but not forgotten. The Nile gives life, but it never promised safety. The morning comes with a light mist hanging over the river, softening the edges of the palms and making the world feel half asleep. You know what the day demands, the irrigation waltz. No music, no ballroom, but plenty of rhythm. And if you miss your steps, someone else gets your water. You walk toward the canal head, where a few men are already working the shaduf, the ancient counterweighted water lift. A long pole with a bucket on one end and a stone weight on the other, it creaks like an old man's knees as they pull water from the Nile and swing it into the channel. Each movement is a smooth arc, bucket down, scoop, lift, pivot, pour, repeated over and over until your arms forget they're tired. Mainstream accounts will tell you that these irrigation systems were marvels of ancient engineering, still in use in the 18th century. True enough, but they don't mention the petty politics. Who gets to draw water first? Who accidentally diverts more into their field than agreed? There's no referee here, only a mix of tradition, negotiation, and the occasional passive-aggressive mud wall built overnight to block a neighbor's ditch. You take your turn at the shaduf. The rope is rough against your palms, already damp from splashes. The bucket dips, disappears into the brown-green water, then comes up heavy and dripping. You swing it over and empty it into the narrow channel that snakes away toward your patch of field. The sound of rushing water into dry furrows is one of the most satisfying noises you know, second only to the pop of a date fruit splitting in the sun. Some fields use the newer sakia, a water wheel turned by oxen or donkeys. You pass one on your way to check the lower ditches. The wheel groans as the animal plods in endless circles, lifting water in a chain of clay pots that spill into the main channel. The donkey looks bored out of its mind, ears flicking lazily. If donkeys could roll their eyes, this one would be doing it constantly. Historians still argue whether farmers in this era coordinated irrigation times through formal schedules or just showed up early and hoped for the best. From what you've seen, it's a little of both. The oldest men always seem to get the best slots, and you're never quite sure whether it's respect, intimidation, or just the fact that they wake up before the rest of you. As the day warms, the smell of wet earth fills the air again. You watch small channels snake across the field, water glinting as it moves between furrows. Tiny frogs leap aside, annoyed at the disturbance. A heron stalks along the edge, hoping the water will flush out a careless fish. There's a beauty in it. The way the flow shifts and curves, the way the ground drinks in the Nile's gift. And yet, the work is constant. Too much water, and the roots rot. Too little, and the plants wither. You're not just farming the land, you're farming the river's patience. By the time the sun leans toward the west, the waltz is done for the day. You coil the ropes, wipe your hands, and look over your patch. For now, it glistens. Tomorrow, the dance begins again. The heat has not quite burned away the last of the morning cool when you notice a line of footprints in the damp sand by the canal. They aren't human, at least, not the kind you're used to. And the spacing tells you the creature moves low to the ground. You follow the trail a short distance, and there it is, a Nile monitor lizard, stretched out on a warm, flat stone, basking like it owns the place. Its skin is patterned in gold and brown, glinting slightly when it shifts, and its long tail could easily whip the dust from your ankles if it wanted. You pause a few paces away, because while it's not as terrifying as a crocodile, it still has claws and a mouth full of teeth designed to make small animals regret their life choices. Mainstream history mentions these monitors in passing. Scavengers, opportunistic hunters, sometimes pests raiding chicken coops. But the old men here will tell you they are clever. Too clever. They'll claim a monitor can remember where it found food for years, and that once it learns a path to your poultry, you'll need more than a fence to stop it. The lizard flicks a forked tongue, tasting the air in slow, deliberate motions. You remember that quirky tidbit from Mariam, the weaver, who swears she once saw a monitor sneak into her laundry pile just to curl up in the sun-warmed cloth. She had to chase it away with a broom, and she still claims it looked offended, as though she had violated some silent sunbathing agreement. Historians still argue whether these reptiles were ever domesticated in any sense. Some point to ancient depictions of people holding them, but others say the art just shows captured animals for trade or ritual. Watching this one's unblinking eyes and the slow flex of its claws, you can't imagine it taking orders from anyone. It shifts, sliding off the rock with that fluid, undulating walk that always makes you think of water moving uphill. Its claws scratch softly against the dirt as it disappears into the reeds, leaving only the faint sound of rustling stalks. You wonder if it's heading for the grain store, the chicken coop, or maybe just another sunny spot to drape itself across like a scaly king. A dragon in miniature, you think. If it had wings, you'd be in trouble. Your sandals sink slightly into the riverside muck as you approach the water's edge, and you can already smell it. The scent of silt, dark and mineral-rich, the Nile's most generous gift. To most people outside this floodplain, mud is just something to wash off. But here, it's treasure. After the floodwaters retreat, they leave behind a glossy black layer that clings to your fingers like wet clay. You scoop up a handful, letting it ooze slowly back to the ground. This is where your next harvest begins, not with seeds, not with rain, but with the river's yearly delivery of finely ground mountain dust, carried hundreds of miles from far to the south. Mainstream historians love to note that the Nile's silt was the reason Egypt could sustain such dense farming for thousands of years. They are not wrong. Without it, the land would have been as dry and unforgiving as the desert that presses in on both sides. But they don't usually talk about the strange little rituals people have around it, like how your neighbor Khalid insists on walking barefoot in the freshly dropped silt to wake it up, as though the mud needs his toes to remind it what to do. The quirky bit. Some folks smear a thin layer of it on their faces, claiming it clears the skin and wards off sunburn. You tried it once. The smell lingered for 2 days, and you're not sure if the stares you got in the market were admiration or just people wondering why your head smelled like a riverbank. Historians still argue whether the distribution of silt was even across the basin, or if certain bends in the river consistently got richer deposits. The farmers here, though, don't need debates. They know whose land turns a darker black after the flood, and they mutter about it in tones that make you think of envy disguised as weather commentary. The fields are soft underfoot as you walk, each step sinking just enough to make a pleasing squelch. You drag a toe through the surface, tracing idle patterns. If you press hard, the imprint holds its shape, and you imagine a bored laborer in some future century puzzling over why there's a perfect drawing of a fish in the soil layer. Children nearby are rolling little balls of silt into shapes, miniature animals, crude but recognizable. One makes a turtle, another a lopsided camel. They'll dry to cracked husks in the sun by tomorrow, but for now it's a moment of creation before the work starts in earnest. In a week, seeds will be pressed into this softness, trusting the Nile's gift to do the rest. For now, it lies open and waiting, rich and dark, and full of silent promise. The sun is still low enough to cast long, straw-colored shadows when the donkeys begin their slow parade. You hear them before you see them. The clop of hooves on the packed dirt path, the occasional bray that sounds like a rusty gate being swung too quickly, and the gentle jingle of harness rings. They arrive in single file, led by boys who've learned to match their walking pace to the animal's unhurried rhythm. Each donkey carries bulging sacks of emmer grain, tied across its back so the load hangs evenly. You notice one particularly stocky animal with a tear in its feed sack, leaving a thin trail of kernels like a breadcrumb path for some very optimistic pigeon. Mainstream history tells you donkeys have been beasts of burden here for thousands of years, long before the 18th century. They were, and still are, the backbone of rural transport, able to carry loads over rough terrain where wheels sink or splinter. But here's a quirky local detail. Some farmers braid charms into their donkeys' manes, tiny knots threaded with colored wool, meant to keep away the evil eye. The knots look a bit like someone started weaving a bracelet and got distracted halfway through. Historians still argue whether these adornments were purely decorative or had deeper religious significance tied to older pre-Islamic beliefs. As far as you can tell, the donkeys don't care, as long as their route includes enough pauses for grazing. You walk alongside one for a while, feeling the ground tremble faintly under its steady gait. It glances at you with that long-lashed, vaguely judgmental look donkeys seem to have perfected over centuries. The air smells faintly of straw and sun-warmed hide, with an undertone of grain dust that clings to your clothes when you brush against the sacks. Up ahead, a farmer urges his donkey forward with soft clucks of his tongue, not a whip. You've been told the animals respond better to patience than to force. And judging by the stubborn way this one plants its hooves when a goat wanders into the path, that's probably true. By mid-morning, the procession will reach the market, spilling their cargo into the hum of bargaining voices and the flutter of coin purses. But for now, it's just you, the slow shuffle of hooves, and the hypnotic rhythm of a journey that hasn't changed in living memory. You hear the market before you even step into it, a blend of voices calling prices, the occasional goat bleat, and the sharp crack of a pot being set down a little too hard on a wooden stall. The air changes here. It's thicker with smells, fresh bread, dried fish, baskets of herbs giving off sharp green scents, and the unmistakable tang of sweat on a warm morning. Your eyes adjust to the jumble. Shade cloths stretch between poles, casting moving patches of shadow as they flap in the breeze. Merchants squat behind their wares, calling to passers-by with the kind of persuasive tone that makes you think even if you weren't hungry, you'd leave with 3 flatbreads and a jar of pickled radishes. Mainstream history notes that 18th century Nile markets were hubs not just for food, but for news, disputes, and matchmaking. A place where you could trade a basket of figs for a sack of salt, and also hear that your cousin's neighbor's brother was planning to buy a new donkey. But here's the quirky bit. There's a man near the date stall who claims to predict next season's flood level by watching how quickly flies land on fresh fish. You're not sure which is stranger, the claim or the fact that several people swear by his accuracy. Historians still argue whether market haggling was more about genuine price negotiation or simply a social ritual everyone enjoyed, even if the price barely budged. You watch one such exchange over a copper cooking pot. The buyer sighs, the seller frowns, both gesture dramatically, and then they end with the same number they started with, but with smiles, as if they've both just won. Children dart between stalls, sometimes carrying messages, sometimes carrying nothing but the thrill of dodging adults. A group of women are gathered near the spice merchant, their voices low but laughter quick to burst through. You catch the earthy scent of cumin mixing with something sweet, cinnamon maybe, and it clings to your hair as you pass. One corner of the market is quieter, occupied by a pair of scribes offering to write letters for those who can't. Their reed pens scratch on papyrus, the sound oddly soothing amid the chaos. You wonder how many secrets and promises pass through those hands each week. By the time you leave, your arms are a little heavier, your purse a little lighter, and your ears still echo with the market's rhythm, a steady pulse of trade and chatter that will pick up again tomorrow, just as it has for centuries. You follow the path that winds back toward the fields, but instead of heading straight to the crops, you veer toward a low, crumbling structure just past a stand of palm trees. Its mud brick walls are faded the color of toast left too long in the sun, and the doorway is no more than a rough arch with a sagging reed mat draped across it. Inside, the air is cooler and the smell is, well, pungent would be polite. This is the communal granary, where the village stores its grain harvest. The structure's thick walls keep the interior dark and dry, though not entirely free of the scuttling sound of something small moving in the shadows. The floor is packed earth, polished smooth by years of bare feet, and several large clay bins line the walls, their round mouths sealed with mud to keep the contents safe. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize the importance of granaries in Nile farming communities. They were essentially the bank vaults of the village. Without these stores, one bad flood year could mean hunger for everyone. But the quirky bit? Villagers here hang little clay charms shaped like cobras above the grain bins, claiming it discourages actual snakes from slithering in. You're not sure if that's true, but you do notice one particularly realistic charm that makes you step back instinctively. Historians still argue whether these storage buildings were always communal, or if some were privately owned by wealthier families who rented space to others. In this village, it seems to be both, a mix of shared responsibility and quiet competition. A man with a wooden scoop is measuring out grain for a woman with a woven basket, counting the scoops aloud so there's no dispute later. Another man is patching a small crack in one of the bins with a smear of wet mud, humming tunelessly as he works. The light from the doorway catches on floating dust motes, making them drift lazily in the air like tiny golden insects. You trail a hand along the side of one bin, feeling the faint vibration from the grain settling inside. Somewhere under the surface, you can hear the soft trickle of kernels shifting, a sound like dry rain. As you step back out into the sunlight, the warmth hits you hard after the dim coolness inside. The granary recedes behind you, still guarding its treasure of food and quietly absorbing the day's small comings and goings, as it has for more generations than anyone can count. Past the granary, you wander toward a cluster of reed mats spread out on the ground, each covered in a scattering of pale, oval shapes that glisten faintly in the sun. The smell hits you next, sharp, briny, and just shy of unpleasant. This is where the fish are laid out to dry, their scales catching little bursts of light when the breeze shifts. A pair of men squat nearby, turning fish with slow, practiced movements, their fingers slick with oil and salt. One of them hums an old tune that sounds like it's missing half its notes, but the rhythm works. Almost hypnotic. Mainstream historical records show that dried fish was a staple in 18th century Nile diets, especially for those far from fresh catches. It kept for months if properly salted and could be crumbled into stews or eaten as a salty snack. The quirky bit. Some villages use dried fishtails as makeshift currency for small trades. Not the main economy, but enough that a child could swap 2 tails for a honey cake. You can't decide if that's clever or just a little unsanitary. Historians still argue whether this small-scale fish currency was widespread or only appeared in isolated pockets along the river. It's one of those details that's hard to prove since fishtails don't exactly leave a lasting archaeological record. One of the men gestures to a small clay pot beside him, explaining that it's full of a spice mix, ground coriander, garlic, and something he calls the river's pepper, which turns out to be a kind of wild seed gathered near the banks. He sprinkles it over the fish before the final hours of drying, giving the meat a sharp, peppery scent that makes you understand why the smell attracts the occasional stray cat. You notice a line of fishing nets strung between 2 palm trunks, drying in the same sun. The fibers are dark with use, knotted so many times you can barely follow the original weave. A little boy is untangling one with exaggerated care, his face serious, like he's been given the single most important task in the world. Beyond him, the river glints, the source of all of it, shimmering with that steady, indifferent flow. You breathe in the mix of sun-baked reeds, salted air, and slow human labor, and for a moment, the rest of the world feels very far away. Following the scent of something earthy and damp, you find yourself near the edge of a low marsh, where the ground gives slightly under your feet. The air is thicker here, humming with insect life, and the water lies in shallow pools that reflect the reed stalks swaying above them. This is where the papyrus grows, tall, triangular stems topped with those fluffy green heads that look like nature's attempt at a feather duster. 2 women stand knee-deep in the water, slicing stems near the base with small, curved knives. Each cut releases a faint, green-sweet smell that's almost cucumber-like. They pile the stalks on a reed mat laid across a log, the fresh stems gleaming in the sun. Mainstream history reminds you that papyrus was more than just writing material. It was also used for mats, baskets, boat hulls, and even sandals. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some villagers believe sleeping on a papyrus mat can cool the dreams, making nightmares less likely. You imagine a modern marketing label for that. Papyrus Dream Cooling Sleep Pad, now 100% crocodile-free. Historians still argue whether papyrus cultivation in the 18th century was primarily for local use or for trade with larger towns downstream. In a place like this, it's clearly both. Some of the harvest will be stripped, pressed, and dried into writing sheets, while other bundles will be woven into mats before the day is over. A young boy helps by stripping the green skin from a stem, revealing the pale, spongy core inside. You can see how it could be sliced into strips and pressed flat, the ancient technique still alive in small hands. The boy pauses to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of green sap that dries almost instantly in the heat. Nearby, a man uses a bundle of papyrus as a makeshift bench, sitting cross-legged as he mends a fishing net. He hums softly, the tune mingling with the steady rustle of reeds in the wind. You stand still for a while, listening to the rhythm of slicing, stacking, and tying. It's easy to forget, in this sleepy marsh edge, that the rest of the village is bustling. But the papyrus workers seem content to keep their pace, steady as the river, sending their harvest back toward the heart of the community, where it will be turned into things both practical and, if you believe the mat sleepers, dream-worthy. You leave the papyrus marsh with the sound of rustling reeds still in your ears and follow a narrow dirt path that skirts the river. Soon you come across a small clearing where several earthen mounds rise like oversized loaves of bread left to bake in the sun. The smell of smoke and something sweet bitter hangs in the air. This is where they make beer. A group of women work around a large clay vat set into the ground, stirring with long wooden paddles. The liquid inside is thick, cloudy and warm, sending up a yeasty scent that's oddly comforting. One woman tosses in a handful of crumbled barley bread, which sinks and disappears, beginning the slow process of fermentation. Mainstream history tells you beer was a daily drink along the Nile, safer than river water and full of calories. But here's the quirky tidbit. In this village, beer isn't just for people. Goats and donkeys sometimes get watered-down leftovers as a treat, though you suspect the donkeys have learned to fake thirst just for another swig. Historians still argue whether 18th century brewing here followed strict recipes passed down for centuries, or if it was more of an improvisational art, a toss some bread in, hope for the best method. Watching these women, you think it might be a bit of both. There's clearly a routine, but it bends with whatever the day provides. A young girl is shaping small lumps of mud near one of the mounds. They'll be dried in the sun and later used to patch the brewing vats. She hums to herself, a little off-key but determined. Two men sit nearby, using a wide woven fan to stir the coals under another vat, keeping the temperature steady. The flicker of firelight inside the earthen mound makes it glow like the heart of a kiln. Someone offers you a sip from a small clay cup. The beer is tangy, thick, and slightly sour, more like liquid bread than anything you'd order at a bar. It leaves a warm, mellow weight in your stomach. As you hand the cup back, the river breeze carries the scent of barley mash downstream, mingling with the ever-present smell of wet earth. The brewing area hums with quiet cooperation, each person knowing exactly when to stir, when to feed the fire, and when to leave the brew alone. You step away, the taste lingering, feeling a little more anchored to this place, like you've swallowed a piece of the village itself. The brewing fires fade behind you as you follow another trail toward a patch of rough ground where the grass has been trampled flat. At first, it looks like nothing more than a casual gathering, but then you notice the poles planted upright in the soil, ropes strung between them, and long strips of fabric hanging like lazy sails in the heat. This is the linen yard, a place of dye pots, weaving frames, and the constant whisper of fibers against fingers. A woman sits cross-legged beside a wide, shallow basket, pulling flax fibers from a bundle and smoothing them out in long, patient motions. The strands catch the sunlight, shimmering faintly like spun straw. Nearby, a man works a loom propped between two poles, his hands darting in and out of the warp like a musician playing some invisible harp. Mainstream historical accounts remind you that linen was Egypt's most valued textile for centuries, favored for its coolness in the heat and its ability to take on bright dyes. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some river villages, new parents wove tiny amulets into the hems of baby clothes. Little knots of dyed thread meant to confuse evil spirits so they couldn't find the child. It's basically supernatural camouflage, but softer. Historians still argue whether such charms were just symbolic gestures or if they were genuinely believed to protect. Given the care you see in the weaving here, it's hard to imagine they were added without some deep intention. A pair of children play near a vat of dye, one holding a stick to stir the dark, almost black liquid, the other fishing out a sodden strip of cloth that drips into the dust. Their mother scolds them lightly, but you can see the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. The smell of the dyes is sharp and mineral, almost metallic, and it lingers in the air around the yard. Rolls of finished cloth are stacked under a reed awning, the patterns subtle, mostly stripes or checks, designed more for durability than for display. Still, in the shifting light, the colors come alive. You run your fingers over a finished bolt of fabric, cool, smooth, with that faint crispness only linen has. The loom clicks and hums in the background, a steady counterpoint to the shouts of children and the occasional creak of drying rope. It's an oddly peaceful space, the kind where you could sit for hours, just watching hands turn plants into something soft enough to wear. You wander from the linen yard toward the part of the village where smoke curls up in small, deliberate columns. The scent changes here, less earthy, more like baked clay and charred straw. You've found the pottery kilns, low domed structures of mud brick with arched openings just wide enough for a person to stoop through. The ground is dusted with pale clay powder that clings to your sandals. A man crouches beside one kiln, peering into its heart where a faint orange glow flickers. He feeds thin sticks into the firebox, the dry wood snapping like brittle bones. Behind him, two women sit cross-legged with wide clay discs spinning between their palms. They're shaping small bowls with gentle coaxing motions. The sound of wet clay sliding over hands is soft but steady, like the hush of waves against a shore. Mainstream history says pottery was as essential to Nile life as bread, for storing grain, carrying water, fermenting beer, and even holding the oil that lit homes. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some potters here etch tiny symbols on the bottom of jars before firing them. Not signatures, but little messages to the jar's future contents. One bowl you see has a rough fish scratched into it, perhaps to remind the owner that it once held dried tilapia. Historians still argue whether 18th century rural pottery in Egypt was mostly functional or if it carried significant symbolic meaning. Watching these artisans, you feel it's both. The vessels must work, but they're also stitched into memory. A teenage boy turns a potter's wheel with his foot, the rhythm hypnotic. His hands shape the clay into a tall jar, his fingers leaving faint spirals as he works upward. Once it's done, his mother smooths the rim with a wet cloth, then places it in the sun where a growing family of unfired pieces rests. The heat near the kiln makes you step back, though the potter doesn't seem to notice. His face glistens with sweat, but his eyes are fixed on the glow inside. Now and then he hums under his breath, a sound almost lost under the crackle of wood. You can see the finished goods stacked under a lean-to. Water jars with narrow necks, bowls with flared rims, and wide plates the color of toasted bread. Dust covers them lightly, proof that they've been waiting for someone to carry them home. You leave with the feeling that this place could keep working forever. A small sun-fed factory where fire and earth quietly make everything a village needs. Leaving the pottery kilns, you follow a faint path down toward a quieter bend in the river. Here the banks widen into a muddy shallows where footprints, human and otherwise, press into the damp ground. The air smells faintly of algae and sun-warmed fish. You've reached the fishing camp, where woven baskets lean against a rack and nets hang like enormous cobwebs to dry. A man squats ankle-deep in the water, mending a tear in a long net with deft knots. Beside him, a boy untangles a smaller hand net, pulling free a stubborn reed with the patience of someone who's done this more than a few times. A pile of wicker fish traps sits nearby, cone-shaped with narrow throats, perfect for letting fish swim in but not back out. Mainstream historical accounts note that fish were a crucial protein source along the Nile, often salted or dried for storage. Your quirky tidbit: certain fishermen here carry tiny carved hippo figurines in their pouches, believing they bring luck on the water. The hippo isn't exactly a friendly creature, more keep your distance than good buddy. But in their logic, a carved one has all the strength without the bite. Historians still argue whether small-scale fishing like this in the 18th century was mostly subsistence work, or if surplus catches fed into regional markets. From the look of the baskets, these men might do a bit of both. One woman crouches at the waterline, scraping scales from a fresh catch with a shard of pottery. Each flick sends a silvery scatter onto the mud, where a stray cat waits, eyes locked on the movement. Another woman threads fish onto palm fronds for drying, her hands quick and precise. Out in the shallows, a pair of boys drive fish toward a waiting net by wading slowly and splashing their hands. They glance over at you briefly. One grins, then turns back to the task. The water around them ripples with small flashes of movement, the fish darting like liquid silver in the sun. A breeze off the river cools the air here, carrying the faint hum of the village in the distance. The fishing camp feels both part of and apart from that bustle, its own slow rhythm governed by the pull of the current and the patience to wait for what swims into the net. You walk on, hearing the steady drip of water from the hanging nets fade behind you. The path from the fishing camp winds into a thicket of low acacia and thorn scrub, the kind of place that makes you instinctively watch where you put your feet. The ground here is uneven, pocked with little holes and burrows. A flicker of movement catches your eye, something long and pale sliding under a tangle of roots. You've found the edge of the village where the reptiles hold quiet sway. You pause near a sun-warmed rock where a lizard, mottled brown and gold, lies so still you wonder if it's asleep. Then its eyelid twitches. A slow blink. before it scuttles away in that sideways, almost mechanical gait. Mainstream history tells you that 18th century Egyptians, especially in rural Nile regions, lived alongside an entire caste of reptiles, harmless geckos clinging to mud brick walls, massive Nile monitors lurking near water, and of course, snakes, some venomous, some not. Your quirky tidbit: certain villagers believed a gecko on your wall meant your household would never run out of bread. It's not clear whether the gecko brought luck or just ate the bugs that might have spoiled the grain, but either way, it got to stay rent-free. Historians still argue whether these reptile-related superstitions came from ancient pharaonic beliefs or were shaped more by later folk traditions. The air here is warm and dry, the smell of sun-baked dust mixing with the faint tang of acacia blossoms. A boy wanders past with a long stick, poking gently at the burrows, checking, he says, for the shiny ones, meaning snakes. He doesn't look particularly afraid, just alert, the way you'd be careful around a deep puddle in the dark. By the water's edge, you spot a Nile monitor half submerged, only its eyes and nostrils above the surface. It slides forward without a sound, vanishing into deeper water as if it had never been there. Somewhere further off, a sudden plop marks the retreat of a turtle startled from its basking spot. The village doesn't exactly keep these creatures as pets, but they aren't at war with them either. They're simply part of the shared landscape, tolerated, avoided when necessary, occasionally invoked in a blessing or curse. You walk on, thinking about the quiet truce that lets people and reptiles occupy the same sunlit banks without too much trouble. You leave the warm, reptile-haunted bank and follow a narrow ridge toward the fields. The air changes again. Here it's thicker, sweeter, with that unmistakable hum. Bees. Ahead you spot low wicker domes stacked like fat baskets on their sides, each with a small hole for an entrance. A man crouches beside one, moving slowly, his hands bare but steady. This is the village's beekeeping corner, and the bees don't seem to mind you so long as you keep your movements unhurried. Mainstream history points out that beekeeping along the Nile dates back thousands of years, with honey prized not only as food but as medicine, offering both sweetness and a shelf-stable preservative in a world without refrigerators. Your quirky tidbit: in some villages, keepers believed bees could recognize individual humans by scent, and that insulting a bee, yes, verbally, could cause the whole hive to remember you. The man here laughs softly when you ask. He says it's better not to test it. Historians still argue whether rural 18th century honey production was mostly for local households, or whether it was traded more widely up and down the river. The wicker hives are smeared with mud and cow dung to keep out heat and drafts. You watch as the beekeeper gently lifts a section of comb, golden hexagons dripping with thick amber honey. The smell is almost dizzying, floral and heavy. A few bees cling stubbornly, but most are too busy elsewhere to fuss. He places the comb into a shallow clay bowl where the slow ooze of honey makes time itself feel sluggish. Nearby, a woman strains honey through a loose weave of reeds, letting it pool into a jar. The wax and pollen left behind will be shaped into small cakes, used later for sealing jars or making a simple balm. Above, the air is alive with drifting bees, darting from hive to wildflower and back, a constant quiet choreography. Even the sound, that low, steady buzz, works its way into your chest until you feel it more than hear it. You realize you've been standing perfectly still for minutes without meaning to, lulled by the rhythm of wings and the syrup-slow way sunlight plays over gold. When you finally move on, you catch yourself walking more softly, as though not to disturb the hum still clinging to your ears. You drift away from the beekeeping corner, the hum fading into the wider soundscape of the village. Evening is settling in, softening the edges of every shape. The light turns syrupy over the fields, and the air carries a mix of wood smoke, river musk, and something warm from the cooking fires. People move a little slower now, as if the day's weight is pressing them gently toward rest. A small group gathers near a low mud wall, passing around a pot of lentil stew. Children chase each other in lazy arcs, the dust rising in soft clouds beneath their feet. Someone laughs, not loudly, but enough to roll across the space like a warm stone skipping once before sinking. You ease yourself down onto a worn reed mat offered by an old man, its edges frayed from years of use. Mainstream history would tell you that in 18th century Nile villages, the end of the workday was one of the few moments everyone shared regardless of role, a time for eating, storytelling, and tending to the little repairs life demanded. Your quirky tidbit: in some households, the last person to fall asleep was expected to spit lightly into the ashes of the fire to lock in its luck until morning. Whether that worked is anyone's guess. Historians still argue whether these evening gatherings were more about reinforcing community bonds or simply passing time before sleep, but the effect is the same. Voices rise and fall together, small chores are done without fuss, and a gentle camaraderie settles in like the night air. You notice a cat curling itself into a ball beside the embers, the faint glint of fish scales still stuck to its whiskers from earlier in the day. Above, the first stars appear, sharp in the cooling sky. Somewhere close, a hand drum thumps twice, then falls silent, as if even the music is winding down. The river's whisper is the last sound you focus on, steady, dark, and utterly unhurried, as your gaze drifts with it toward the horizon. Now the scene fades, slow as mist pulling back from water at dawn. The sharp outlines of the fields soften into a velvety blur, their greens sinking into deep blues and shadowed browns. The villagers' voices are no more than threads of sound now, woven loosely into the fabric of the night. You feel the air cool against your skin, carrying a faint sweetness from the last of the flowering reeds. Your steps grow heavier, not from weariness, but from the strange gravity of peace, the kind that anchors you gently without holding you back. The river is still there, of course, murmuring to itself, its surface stitched with the smallest ripples. Even the insects seem to hum more quietly, their chorus stretching and slowing until it becomes part of the night's steady breath. Every movement in this place eases into stillness, a reed bending in the breeze, a spark lifting and fading from the fire, a shadow sliding off the side of a clay pot. The warmth of the day lingers just enough to hold off the chill, wrapping you in a thin, invisible blanket. Somewhere out beyond the dark line of the fields, the world continues. Water flows, wind shifts, creatures stir. But here, inside this circle of quiet, nothing presses forward. Time feels less like a march and more like a deep, unbroken lake. So you let your own breathing match the slow rhythm of the Nile, steady and even. The sounds, the air, the weight of the fading light. They're all holding you in place, just long enough for your mind to loosen its grip. And when it does, you drift, unhurried, into that soft place where the river carries everything away.